Hello, ladies and gentlemen, in my American History 2 class. Once again, I have possibly started in mid-sentence. I apologize. We're all victims of technology this semester, unfortunately. Now, you should be viewing this sometime during week 3, which means you should be viewing this at some point between September the 14th and September the 18th, unless my math is incorrect. If it is, please disregard what I just said. Point is, this is week 4. You should be watching this sometime around then. I've already made a couple of mistakes, I think, in my intro, but that's okay. We're all somewhat sympathetic here, I think. Now, last time, if you remember, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the Plains Wars and situations facing Native Americans after the end of the Civil War. Today, and for the rest of this week, we're going to switch gears a little bit and focus on, again, the issues that some former slaves faced, specifically now that Reconstruction is over. We're going to look a little bit at what that was like. Specifically, we're going to talk about the birth of something called populism and interracial politics. This is something we don't typically hear about in a lot of history classes, so I think it's very important to cover. There was a big period of interracial politics in this country in roughly the 1870s and the 1880s, particularly in North Carolina, as you'll see in topic 2. In the meantime, to start things off, I'll of course show you all the key terms we have for this week, or for this lesson. Again, please make sure you go over these. These are where a lot of your content quiz questions and various mini assignments and writing assignment questions might come from. First off, we're going to look at, of course, populism. It was right there in the title. We're going to look at an organization called the National Grange. We're going to look at the People's Party and the Populist Party. We're going to look at fusion politics. And we'll wrap things up looking at the election of 1896. So again, keep these things in mind. Also, as usual, I want you to be aware of the various upcoming major assignments you need to be worried about. Remember, you'll also have the creative response assignment or a discussion forum assignment when you do not have a major writing assignment or debate assigned. I don't usually take the time to put them on the PowerPoint because they are on Moodle and in the syllabus, but if you're ever confused about those, please let me know as well. But just remember, those will only be due on weeks where you don't have a big writing assignment or a big debate. In the meantime, these are your major assignments you need to worry about. Your final essay thesis statement is coming up this Friday, September the 18th at 5 p.m. I won't take the time to show you all this on Moodle because that takes a very long time, and I think most of you are starting to grasp that at this point. I haven't had many questions about it lately. But just remember, if you have any questions about how to do this assignment, check the final essay prompt on Moodle. Also, of course, feel free to shoot me an email or stop by during office hours if you're ever confused. Next up, you have your second writing assignment due as well. It is going to be due on September 25th at 5 p.m., so not this Friday from when you're viewing this, but the next Friday. The prompt, rubric, and submission area are all located on Moodle, and don't worry, you will have nothing else due this week besides that week besides this writing assignment. And again, yes, I do think this meme was kind of funny and appropriate. Do remember your due dates are all posted on the syllabus and on Moodle. If you have any questions about due dates, please check there first before you come check with me. If there's a mistake, definitely let me know, but otherwise do check there first. Now, getting into the meat of what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the prelude to populism first, or what kind of conditions in the country made populism possible. There were a few post-Civil War economic problems the country had to deal with, particularly after Reconstruction was over. First, there was a big period of low crop prices. Now, this may seem obvious, but imaginary class who's not actually here, why is that a bad thing? Yeah, remember, this is me talking to a camera. It's as awkward for me as it is for you. But yeah, as you could probably guess, especially any of you who are involved in some kind of small business or farming, low crop prices obviously means that the farmers aren't going to be generating much money because you're going to sell a lot of crops, but not necessarily get much back for it. That's going to, of course, hurt especially the farmer and working class people in America. The railroads are monopolized. Why is that such a bad thing? First off, for those of you who don't know what a monopoly is or what a monopolized railroad would be, a monopoly is, of course, when one company, one individual, or just one small group of people own an entire section of a business or the entire business. So to give you an example that's very near and dear to my heart, Disney owns, I think at this point, honestly could be 40 to 50% of at least the mainstream movie business, possibly more. So that's why everything we're getting has a Disney logo slapped on it these days. At this time, the railroads were essentially in the same state, if not worse. As you might have guessed, for any of you who know a little bit about about shipping goods potentially, if there's a railroad monopoly, the railroads can charge you as much as they want to transport your goods. Because remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that the Transcontinental Railroad had just popped up and was trading things all across the country. If just a small group owns all the railroads, they can charge whatever they want. You can't do anything about it. These are also there's a couple of review questions in here as well. Please keep in mind the crop lien system and banks. Why was the crop lien system in particular such a big deal, and why especially were those high interest rates such a problem? Make sure you review over that. It was on your content quiz from last week, so hopefully you're all familiar with that by now. Finally, and this is something we'll talk quite a bit about over the next couple of weeks, there was a strong corporate influence in politics at the time. What typically happens when there's a big corporate influence in politics? Think about what all the politicians say in their campaign speeches when they talk about ending corporate influence. What are they trying to do? Imaginary audience, again. Yeah, this is something we're probably all familiar with, at least to a certain degree. It potentially can lead to political corruption, bribing people, giving corporate companies advantages they don't deserve, that kind of thing. That was a big problem a lot of people were concerned with at this time. So think as we go through this, what kind of people these problems are going to hurt, and how exactly they're going to solve these problems. If you have all this to worry about, what are you going to do? Well, as you might have guessed from the topic of this lesson, or the title of this lesson, one of the main things they did was try to come up with something called populism. Populism is actually a political approach people will still use today. For example, some of you might have noticed if you can remember, in the 2016 election, and it came up again during this election cycle, both particularly Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump would refer to themselves as populists. So this is still an issue that people try to use today. Whether or not either of them are a populist is a whole different story. We might get to that a little bit later if we have time. In the meantime, populism is essentially an approach where you try to appeal to ordinary people, particularly the working class, who feel their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups. As you probably guessed from what we talked about the last couple of weeks and what I just mentioned, the ordinary people, of course, is referring to these working class individuals, particularly the poor farmers, and definitely the freed African Americans we've been discussing, who had all sorts of economic barriers and limitations when they tried to get their independence. The established elite groups, who would those people be? Imaginary class. This would be so much more interesting if people were actually here. But what are you going to do? Alright, yeah, as you might have guessed, again, from what we just discussed, it's a lot of these corporate elites who people started to have problem with. The rich who are owning all these monopolies, controlling the economy of the country. Essentially, during this time period, people started to feel that they wanted a political party that represented their interests instead of just focusing on the interests of rich people. Again, one reason why populism is still a popular idea today. Many people don't like the two-party system. They want to seek some other kind of option. This was essentially the same kind of drive. Now, there are a couple of problems that we'll discuss over the next little while that limited a populist's ability to organize. One of the main problems is that a lot of these people were rural farmers. They were not very successful in advocating for themselves in comparison to their urban industrial counterparts. A couple of very simple reasons for this. One was just the physical distance. This might seem obvious again, but why would that be such a big deal? Yes, exactly, student who isn't actually here. It literally is just hard to organize when you don't have many people concentrated in a very large space. A lot of these people can't really communicate with their neighbors very easily. You can't really band together if you only leave your home on occasion and you're on an isolated farm. Rural individualism is something we'll keep talking about quite a bit in this class as well. It's essentially that Jefferson farmer ideal. I don't need anybody else. I can be an independent farmer and just take care of myself. A lot of these people bought into that idea that they didn't need the government's help. They didn't want to get involved with the big government. I was trying to make a movie reference. Big Brother. There we go. Took me a second. So, the fact that these farmers are very isolated and aren't very willing to work together. What are maybe some of the ways that they're going to have to accomplish or solve some of these problems? Particularly their isolation. All right, for those of you who know a little bit more about maybe the art of war, for example, this is actually an appropriate time for that phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If you're all banded together against these corporate influences, you're going to find people who agree with you that you can band together with that you might not otherwise. So one of the ways they did this was by forming their own influential groups to try to influence politics. First off, you had the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, slash sometimes just called the Grange, or it was often known as the National Grange as well, as you can see here in one of their stamps. They had a few main goals they thought would improve companies and corporate life in America. One of the first is that they wanted to sell cooperatives. Does anybody there watching at home, or wherever you're watching this, know what a cooperative is? These awkward pauses are my least favorite part, by the way. I don't know how you all feel about them. But a cooperative is essentially, it's a different way to own stock, essentially, or to have some type of ownership in a company. Typically in a corporation, some very rich and influential people buy a huge chunk of the company. They get a huge chunk of the profits as a result. A cooperative is when the workers themselves buy just a little bit of a stock in the company, and they all share the wealth from the company somewhat equally. So this is again a way to push back against corporate ideas. Instead of having the owners of the company who don't actually do the labor own a huge chunk of the company, they wanted the laborers to profit from the company a bit more directly. So again, something you hear a lot about today by more democratic politicians, especially some sort of wealth. This is essentially calling for wealth distribution. They're arguing that we're the ones who are working. We need to get the fruits of our labor. They also would support third-party politicians instead of lobbying. So why would they want to support these third-party politicians? Again, awkward or audience at home. So yeah, again, they didn't like these two, like I mentioned, they didn't like these two established political parties. They wanted to find politicians who supported their own interests. Finally, they wanted to get regulations on railroads and crop distributors. Now again, go back to what I talked about at the very beginning. Why would those regulations benefit regular workers? All right, again, thank you audience at home who I'm assuming is answering this. It's pretty simple. Again, like I said, the railroads are the ones who are transporting these goods all across the country. The crop distributor companies that use these railroads also get a chunk of the profits. If you regulate them, you can theoretically assume that the workers and producers will get more of the profit and won't have everything taxed off or taken off from fees by the railroad companies and the crop distributors. They did have one significant effect that I want to look at before we move on, but most of their early efforts were failures. One of the things they were able to successfully lobby for was the Moon versus Illinois Supreme Court case in 1877. This Supreme Court case ruled that state governments could regulate a business that affected a public interest. So, can anyone define for me back home what a public interest is? Yeah, it's pretty much there in the name. A public interest is just any interest or business or organization that is crucial for the entire public and for the society as a whole. This law was mainly used to help out or to regulate railroads specifically. Because again, remember, railroads at this time were very crucial because there's what's transporting all the people, all the goods, and especially all the products all across the country to keep the economy going. So this could ensure that there were some limits on what railroads were allowed to charge to transport things. Now, however, a lot of their other efforts were failures. Any idea on what some of their failures were, or why they had some of their failures? I went over it pretty quick just now, so you might have missed it. But remember something I said earlier. They supported third-party politicians, but they didn't lobby on their own. For those of you who don't know what lobbying is, think about, let's use a very prominent example these days, the NRA or the National Rifle Association. Don't worry, anyone who's watching this, I'm not going to give my 2 cents on them. Don't want to step into that minefield. However, they are a great example of a political lobby group. As many of you I'm sure are aware, the NRA very passionately lobbies politicians, especially on the conservative side, to try to get them to support the Second Amendment and to support the right to bear arms, people to support the right to bear all sorts of different firearms, have access to ammunition, all that fun stuff. So these early organizations, they didn't want to lobby politicians. They just thought they would support the politicians they liked, but they weren't willing to politically lobby politicians directly. That's what historians credit as being one of the major reasons this Grange organization really wasn't that effective. They weren't really able to get any political influence done. So again, it's very debatable about whether this group was successful or not at all. Keep that in mind. That's something we're going to keep debating over this whole week and as we go into the future a little bit. Is this actually a victory, and were these groups successful? We'll come back to that. In the meantime, let's get a little bit more into the actual politics of the People's Party, or the Populists. In 1891, the Populists in the country actually formed a political party called the People's Party, also known as the Populists. The Populists were a group made up of various farmer alliances, including the Colored Farmers Alliance, which boasted 1 million members. I'm going to elaborate on this more a little bit as we go, but this is one of the big reasons why these groups started to become a little bit more successful. Remember, like I said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. These groups didn't always get along, but allying with African American groups as well got you a lot more of a voice and a lot more supporters. The Populists were also benefited by the Panic of 1893. In 1893, there was a great economic depression, and there were low crop prices all across the country. Now, obviously, that sounds pretty terrible, right? So why, in the name of all that is holy, would this Panic of 1893 be a good thing for the People's Party? Alright, well, while you hopefully think on that at home, I'm going to give you a bit of an example that more people are probably familiar with. What is one of the things right before in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s that allowed the Nazi Party to take over? Now, by the way, I'm not calling the populists Nazis, but it is very relevant to how the fringe political groups take power or get influence. So yeah, for those of you who are a bit more familiar with World War II history or European history, big reason the Nazis got into power is because after the economic crisis after World War I, people thought that their established political parties or government in Germany had let them down. They threw their support behind the Nazis party. Very similar things happened to the Populists and the People's Party in the 1890s. After this panic happened, people were even more frustrated with the Democrats and the Republicans. They started to turn a bit more to the People's Party. Specifically, of course, we have Thomas E. Watson, one of the most famous members from Georgia, who actually did run for president. This is also a common theme we're going to keep seeing really throughout the semester, but particularly with the People's Party. Similarly to libertarians today, for example, a lot of these groups try to call back to the founding of the country and claim the support of the founding fathers. So you would see this vote under the Liberty Bell slogan a lot of the time. It's again a propaganda tactic to say, hey, we're allied with these great founding fathers, you should support us. Keep that in mind as well. That kind of tactic is really still used today, but especially over some of the stuff we're going to talk about this semester. After the People's Party and populism really got underway, fusion politics became more of a thing as well. Fusion politics was a political practice throughout especially the 1890s when white populists and black Republicans would vote or would cooperate with each other in political parties and campaigns. So essentially, they would pick a politician that was more likely to win. They would all throw their support behind those politicians and vote for united party lines. So again, like I said before, what are some of the benefits of this strategy? People sitting at home. Alright, yeah, it's exactly what I mentioned earlier. It's essentially just getting you more support and getting you more bodies. If you're willing to ally with some of these African American groups who obviously are struggling with these same problems because most of them were sharecroppers, they relied on the railroads to get the product out, they were of course a part of the bank and crop lien system. So obviously they have these same issues. If you can get them on your side, you have a lot more support. However, what are the limitations for this strategy? And specifically, think about the time period and what just happened in our country. Alright, yes, again, audience at home, very good answer. As you can probably imagine, this of course is still a very racist time in our country. We'll talk about that a bit more, especially next time. But remember, bringing in these African American organizations essentially gave white supremacists an easy way to attack these groups. As you may have seen in the reading, if you've already looked at that, people were very scared of black supremacy at this time. They were worried that since slaves were free and there had been some improvements for equality, white supremacy was going to end. They would have to worry about black supremacy and black domination. Bringing in these African American groups with these conventions, as you can see here in North Carolina, because again, this is very common in North Carolina, makes it very easy to attack these groups for supposedly supporting African American domination. That's something we'll see, as I said again, especially in the next lesson. In the meantime, one of the last things I'll mention with these guys is one of their major selling points throughout many of their political elections, and that was the currency issue of the 1890s. During this time period, especially because of the panic, people are trying to decide what kind of standard to use in American currency. On one hand, you have gold bugs, which were individuals who wanted America to use less plentiful gold as a standard for American currency. This would supposedly keep the currency in the country more stable. There are also those who wanted to use, the other group were the ones who wanted to use silver, called the Silverites. They, of course, like I said, wanted the silver standard to be used for American currency instead. They believed that they argued supposedly that this would get more currency in the hands of small farmers and smaller business owners and stimulate the economy as a result. Now, which type of groups do you think are going to support each side? I see it. Based on the themes of this class, thank you again for your hopeful answer back home, audience. This is, again, pretty much along these socioeconomic lines. The gold bugs were, again, those corporate powerful interests who wanted the currency to be more stable. The Silverites were the poor farmers who just wanted to have some kind of access to currency. So again, this divided people and became a big talking point for the populists especially. This debate led to really one of the most mixed bag political results for the populists in their entire existence. And this was, as you might have guessed, the election of 1896. In 1896, there was, of course, a Democrat and a Republican running. The Democrat was William Jennings Bryan, and the Republican was William McKinley. Interestingly, William Jennings Bryan, just like the populists, supported the silver standard. He also used populist language and populist rhetoric. He was quoted in a speech as saying, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." What are a couple of things he's doing here by using this type of language? I'll give you a second to read over it, which you're hopefully doing at home. I feel like I've lost a little bit of my power having to give lessons like this. But yeah, as you can probably see, one particular thing he's doing is he's, again, calling upon those oppressed people and the people who feel like they're being ignored by political interests. He specifically mentions press down upon the brow of labor. So again, direct appeal to working class individuals. Also, of course, as many politicians still do, he's coloring his speech with a lot of religious symbolism and religious language. So again, it's the idea that we're being persecuted, having crowns of thorns pushed upon us. The working man is being crucified. So again, suggesting that God is on the side of the working class and trying to get religious support for his campaign as well. Still very common things that happen today. Now, this might be a bit more complicated, so I do want to throw it out there as well. Why might this be both a good and a bad thing for the populists? Because this again shows really why the Populist Party could be considered a very mixed bag. I really wish I had people to talk to. It was just me and my cat. Yeah, as some of you might have noticed, since he's using populist language, that demonstrates that populists and populist interests are starting to have an influence on our government. If the populists were an influential and powerful group, someone like William Jennings Bryan wouldn't really have to listen to them at all. However, this is also credited as being one of the reasons that the populists declined in popularity overall. Essentially, what's happening is the Democrats are starting to steal portions of their political platform in order to lure voters over to their side. So again, very relevant, you could argue, for some of our two-party political issues today. So because of this, the Populist Party actually started to decline in influence because a lot of former populists started to go to the Democratic Party instead. The Republican, William McKinley, as you might imagine, he supported the gold standard, and he actually accused Bryan of having a communistic spirit in one of his speeches. Yeah, why is that significant? I'll have you think about that for a second. All right, well, just to explain the significance of that a little bit, think about how many times Bernie Sanders was accused of being at least a socialist, which he's basically stated that himself to a certain extent at least, but also a communist. And as for those of you who are aware, we have things like the Red Scare coming up, this Cold War coming up. This shows how deeply rooted America has been in communism against communism for a long time. That idea is still a that idea is still a big debate to this day. McKinley, as you might have guessed, ended up winning the presidency. So even though Bryan didn't win, he still showed the influence of populists. So again, to look ahead, what kind of backlash do you think the fusion politics received? Keep in mind why. We'll answer that in the next lesson. Also, you will have a creative response assignment this week, like I mentioned, because the only thing you have due this week is just your thesis statement. Also, the full handout is in your readings on Moodle. It is not on Moodle at this time. I'm going to post this tomorrow because I'm currently recording this on Saturday, but it will be there by the time you view this, hopefully sometime on Monday or Tuesday. So, these are some political cartoons that were published actually in North Carolina in the year of 1898. So again, you have obviously very racist depictions of an African American here. When you go over this cartoon, look at some of the symbolism, try to figure out what message they're trying to get across, and specifically what kind of dangers they believe Negro rule is going to represent for this country. Very similar cartoon here. Again, very racist depictions of African Americans. This is a very common thing you would see in the country at this time, and really coming up into much more recent times than it should have been. But again, don't just take this at face value. Look at some of the symbolism and some of the things you see written on here. What exactly do they believe is the threat of African American rule, and how are they planning on stopping it? Very similar thing is here as well. What kind of threat do African Americans pose here according to these white supremacist cartoons? And again, what are potential solutions? Same thing here as well, very similar. What's the threat? How are we going to stop it? Again, very similar situation here. Particularly with this one, take a look at both of these individuals. Why are they portrayed the way you think they're portrayed? In particular, think of who this guy looks like. Those of you who are familiar with Civil War history should probably be pretty familiar with who this guy is being depicted like. Why might that be significant, for example? What's going on their political platforms right here, and how is that significant? What kind of message are they trying to get across here? Then I also have for you a couple of newspaper articles focusing on red shirts, which we'll talk about a little bit next week, and an individual named F.N. Simmons, who is very influential and important for the event we're going to talk about next time, the Wilmington Race Riot, which unfortunately many of you probably have not heard of, which is one reason I want to make sure we cover it in this class. In the meantime, final reminders again, your final essay thesis statement is coming up on the 18th, and your second writing assignment is coming up on the 25th at approximately 5 p.m. If you have any questions about any of these assignments, please let me know as soon as possible. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for today. Make sure you check that work schedule I posted so you know what order to get things done in. And once again, let me know if you have any questions. Adios.